Chris, welcome back from Washington.
Well, thank you.
Caitríona, hello in Washington.
I'm still here.
And James,
Hello.
you and I have just been here throughout.
We've just been here throughout.
I think I'm probably the only person in this podcast who's never been in the Oval Office and never witnessed one of the pool sprays when everyone's like shouting and it's all cameras. What is it actually like, Caitríona? What's the Oval Office actually like in those moments?
It's kind of like what you see on TV, I think. It's very intense. The Oval Office is much smaller than you might think it is based on, looking at it on TV, the real one, and in movies and so on as well. And on those moments when there are foreign leaders there, like Sir Keir Starmer or, of course, Volodymyr Zelensky last week, and the media are all rustled in and you're shoulder to shoulder, bustled up, jostling for the best possible position because you only have seconds before the leaders start talking. So it's very intense. It's generally quite hot and sweaty. You can have your head under someone else's armpit trying to get your microphone into the best position. But it's always newsmaking, and it's always, for me anyway, regardless of who's sitting in those chairs, it's a kind of pinch me moment, like you're in the Oval Office, the seat of so much power in the world.
And Chris, it must have been very weird for you seeing Keir Starmer there, who's totally different from Donald Trump, in this setup that is totally different from how we operate in British politics.
Yeah, and the curiosity was, so I've been in there before with President Biden for the so-called sprays, where the two leaders would say some warm words, and then there would be this wall of noise from all of us shouting at the same time, making the collective press pool look and sound frankly unhinged.
Yes.
And then we'd be kicked out, and that kind of would be it. With Donald Trump, he turns it into theatre, and he turns it into semi-organised theatre. So in we go. As Caitríona was saying, there's a bit of a scrum to get in there. You go in via the press room, which then involves a corridor that is sufficiently narrow your shoulders are brushing against both sides. It's almost single file. You sort of want to get in early, but if you go in too early, you'll be round at the far side, and you sort of want to be in the middle. And then I'd never done one with Donald Trump before. So I thought, how do you go about trying to get his attention? So when there was the flourish that the Prime Minister did with the letter out of the pocket from the King, and there was a period of silence because the President was reading it, I just filled the silence and said, what does it say?
Yeah.
And then I'd established a sort of eye contact. But what was curious was I thought it would be totally anarchic, utterly anarchic, just shouting the whole way through. Actually, once you'd caught his eye and you filled a gap with a question and then kept on going to the point that he effectively gesticulated to allow you to continue, the rest of the room then quietened down. And then after I'd asked a few questions, I thought we'd better let other people have a go. So sort of fascinating dynamic. And he took pretty much as many questions as there were in the room.
That's the theatre. Let's do some reviews on this episode of Newscast.
Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio.
And Chris back in the studio.
And it's James in the studio too.
And it's Caitríona in the studio in Washington.
And James, I mean, just going back to the Oval Office, and not to obsess about it like a sort of West Wing obsessive, but it has kind of become like the kind of chat show centre of world news. Like everything we're talking about this week is as a result of what Donald Trump says in that room to all those cameras.
I think it's government by rolling conversation. And sometimes that conversation is in the Oval Office. Sometimes, as we saw this week, it's in Congress. Other times it's, in another location of the White House where, as you said, the president...
But it's basically always live.
It's always live. And it's a sort of constant flow. And so instead of it being stop-start like most we're used to, where, the government will occasionally say something, there'll be a press conference or there'll be something, a statement to Parliament, and it's a constant sort of hum. So, for example, and it's not just been, the president this week. We've also seen the vice president go down to the border, taking some ministers with him, and sort of, again, a sort of rolling narrative. And again, just they all stand up, they all say their thing, and they all have a chat, and it's just this sort of that is the nature of the way they want to handle the media. It's the sort of antithesis of the tightly controlled, focused. It's just this sort of constant, very prolix.
What does that mean?
Lots of words.
Yeah.
And the point is that there are risks. because occasionally they get the words wrong, as we saw with the Vice President casting aspersions on the UK and the French in his interview on Fox News. So if you're going to have so many voices out there, there are going to be hiccups and mistakes. But essentially their strategy is clearly just to fill the space with all of their words so that nobody else has a chance to get a word in edgeways.
And Chris, I want to talk to you about Keir Starmer's strategy in a second. Just talking about Donald Trump's strategy, Caitríona, give us some tools to just understand what he's trying to do here, and I'm thinking about the fact that one day he's putting massive tariffs on Canada and Mexico, and then the next day, on Thursday, he's lifting the tariffs on Mexico. Is that just random? Is that by design? What is he actually sort of trying to achieve there?
I don't think it's random. I think it is very purposeful and strategic. And, we're always hearing that phrase from Silicon Valley, run fast and break things. And that's what they're doing. That's his, he's spoken about from the Oval Office in the last few weeks about how, all I know is deals. I'm a deals guy. So he puts out like the kind of worst case scenario and, I am prepared to do this. Look, I'm doing it. And then rolls back from there, as we've seen with the tariffs on Mexico being lifted or at least paused for a month, but not on Canada because the negotiations are going very differently with the Canadian Prime Minister. So this is his kind of playbook, essentially, and we see it with everything. We saw it with the Middle East, with the Gaza Riviera. We've seen it with Russia, Ukraine. We're seeing it with tariffs. It's the same playbook each time.
Starmer's strategy here was to be the bridge between Europe and Washington, which is kind of a bit of a diplomatic cliche. How's that strategy going, do you think?
Well, what he has to try and do is do that. He wants to do that whilst also working out how he deals with this White House on the record all the time, as in all of this stuff in front of the cameras with all of the words that flow. So to rewind a little bit, they were really nervous going out there a week ago. Really nervous. Why? Bottom line, to make this statement of the obvious, they didn't know how it was going to go. They didn't know how Donald Trump would react in this long form in front of the cameras for half an hour or so. They were happy afterwards, without question, and hugely, hugely relieved. But then they've had to deal with this rolling experience of Donald Trump in the White House, Friday night being the classic example after President Zelensky had been in there, and then that whole sequence of responses that we got from European leaders in the immediate aftermath of President Zelensky's time in the Oval Office, and nothing from the Prime Minister. In fact, I was talking to Laura on Newscast on Friday night as we scrambled to put together an episode.
Yeah, we didn't know what he thought.
No, and then at 2 minutes to 10. Not entirely coincidentally, just before I was about to go on the news and say all these European leaders have spoken and the Prime Minister hasn't, and he was beginning to get a bit of grief for that. Number 10 say, he's spoken to the two presidents. In other words, he has sought to be exactly that sort of sense of a bridge between two allies who've just publicly had this almighty row. So he wants to be, as he would see it, the pragmatic leader who can speak to allies discreetly and privately. And how does he think he goes about doing that? Don't shout your mouth off in public. Why? I think the strategy is twofold. One is, if you get into a public slanging match with Donald Trump, you tend to lose because he will find superlatives or insults that are greater. But what we've seen in the last couple of days is they've had to find mechanisms whereby they can push back, but in a way that isn't commentating. So they don't want to commentate on their relationship with Donald Trump. They want it to be as close as it can be, but where there are examples where they feel they have to, then they've tried to find mechanisms. And the classic example was Prime Minister's questions this week after those remarks from J.D. Vance, the Vice President, in that interview on Fox News that had offended lots of people in Europe, including people in the UK, and hence the revival of that ritual that we got used to all those years ago when the UK had forces in Afghanistan and in Iraq, of referring to the anniversaries of the deaths of some of those troops. It's not normal to mark the anniversaries. They did that. They were, if you like, showing, not telling. They did it, but they didn't then offer an explanation as to why. Why they didn't need to. It was obvious.
So that was a really intriguing moment. And James, my first thought was like, oh, that's for domestic consumption. That's to reassure people in Britain who are voters in British elections who heard the vice president slagging off British troops. And that was Starmer sending a message to British people that he's on Vance's case. But then it gets more complicated because actually lots of people in Britain know JD Vance. And I can imagine JD Vance probably did see a clip of that PMQs on his phone, or someone would have sent it to him. So actually the connection, it's a bit more interconnected than that.
Yeah, look, I mean, clearly JD Vance would have been told about it if he hadn't actually watched it himself. But I think it was fairly clear he probably got, the sense I got is that he realised he knew it sort of,
Well, he put out a tweet, didn't he?
Yeah, and there was a bit of a, clarification about it. So he was aware that there was something. He only had to look at the mockery he received at the face of the British tabloids the next morning. Picture of him with a dunce's hat on and all that sort of stuff, which was very sort of traditional, old-fashioned, traditional tabloid treatment of somebody who'd insulted the UK. But I think Chris is absolutely right. It's a new sort of subtle way of pushing back, of asserting yourself. And what the most intriguing one was the first one I can remember is when Mr. Trump called Mr. Zelensky a dictator. And instead of getting into a fight, the Prime Minister just had a conversation with Mr. Zelensky and then just had a readout, normally a fairly bland statement.
An email to journalists.
Today, the Prime Minister spoke to X. They had a wonderful meeting and they agreed to stay in touch. Well, this time, but the Prime Minister, made clear that, he was democratically elected. So in other words, he asserts something which is contrary to what the Trump administration has said, without actually saying the Trump administration are ludicrous and wrong and they shouldn't have said it.
So, Caitríona, being subtle and sort of doing the work rather than shouting about what's going on, does that actually make a difference in Washington, D.C., or the Washington, D.C. that we're all observing nowadays?
Well, an interesting development just in the last while, because, of course, the British Minister of Defence, Healy, is over here meeting the US Defence Secretary, Pete Hegseth, and they made some remarks, those traditional images sitting at a long board table with the UK team on one side and the Americans on the other. And the first thing that Pete Hegseth said was, we have this great warm relationship. I myself stood shoulder to shoulder with British troops on the battlefields in Afghanistan. I know how close our relationship is and how bravely we fought, or words to that effect. But I think, given what we've been saying there about what happened this week, that was a very calculated thing to say. And I think there is an acknowledgement on the American side that was a mess up from JD Vance, although they can't publicly admit that. But Pete Hegseth, referring to it in the first or second sentence out of his mouth, is a way of trying to fix things a bit and re-establish that relationship.
And everyone, what's your theories about this frantic burst of diplomatic activity in places like Brussels and at Lancaster House over the weekend, of lots of European leaders getting together and making pledges of further support for Ukraine militarily, talking about what a peacekeeping force could look like, which to my ears just sounds a little bit premature, because there's not even any negotiations about a peace deal yet, but yet we're talking about how many British or French soldiers might go to which bit of Ukraine to provide reassurance to implement the peace deal. So what's actually the purpose of all of this diplomatic activity? Part of me wonders, is it maybe just like a kind of displacement activity, because while everyone's just waiting for Trump and Putin to decide what they want to do?
I think you're absolutely right. It seems it's putting the cart before the horse. But the reason is that's because Donald Trump has put the cart before the horse. Donald Trump has said, I'm not interested in security guarantees, and I'm not sure I'm going to give the American air cover and backstop that the Europeans are asking for. So the Europeans say, right, well, look, one way that we can try and get into that argument with the Americans is to say, let's, instead of it just being the Brits and the French saying, well, we'll put some boots on the ground, increase the number of countries, increase the amounts of capability, so that the Europeans can go back to the Americans and say, look, we're serious about this. This does matter. And you know what? It's not all going to be American-led. We're going to do the heavy lifting. The British Prime Minister is already talking about not just boots on the ground, but planes in the air. In other words, saying it's we're prepared to commit some resource to doing the air cover. It won't just be the Americans. So you won't be entirely by yourselves. As a way of trying to get back into the White House and the administration's thinking and get Donald Trump to try and change his mind about this. Now, whether that succeeds is a very open question. But I think that's why we're having that conversation, because the initial response from some European leaders was, this is all a bit previous. We shouldn't really get into that. But actually, they've all realised now, actually, this is not, as well as making more generic pledges about defence spending and stuff, it's about how can the Europeans say to the Americans, we're being serious, to try and get a hearing, which previously they haven't, because Donald Trump in his public utterances have made it very clear that he doesn't want the Americans involved in a backstop.
So it's almost as simple as
narrowing the gap a bit.
Well, or presenting Europe not as losers, because Donald Trump doesn't like losers. So it's making Europe look stronger and look like winners and look like people you want to partner with rather than people you want to insult.
I think there's a bit of that. I think narrowing the gap between what Donald Trump is willing to say at the moment and what Europe has been saying. And then what we've had today on Thursday is a crumb of detail, which is a number from British officials, approximate number, of around about 20 countries that are willing to be part of what Keir Starmer calls this coalition of the willing. Every subsequent question you would reasonably ask off the back of a detail like that, we don't have an answer to. Like who are they and what are they willing to do? Looks like it's primarily European and Commonwealth. It looks like not all of them would be in a space where they'd be willing to commit forces. But you get a sense that there is a whole blizzard of meetings going on. I was really struck actually the day talking to Ursula von der Leyen briefly, the President of the European Commission, outside the summit that James and I were at Lancaster House, and similar noises in the days since, about how, at least in their language, muscular they are now willing to sound, as if to say, we get it. And then can that get to a place where, alongside what the UK is saying about air cover and boots on the ground, as James saying, that President Trump may be persuadable to say, OK, Europe is pulling its weight here, and maybe we can do something to get to a place where something is feasible if President Zelensky is willing to wear it, and if Vladimir Putin is, which are massive ifs, aren't they?
And Caitríona, help us understand what's behind all this pressure that's being applied on Zelensky by Donald Trump. Is it a tactical thing in the build-up to some negotiations, or is it just there's animosity between them all? Because actually Donald Trump got impeached the first time round because of a phone call he had with Volodymyr Zelensky a few years ago.
Yeah, that definitely is underpinning their relationship. But also, Donald Trump does not want to be involved in conflicts in other nations. He says it all the time. He said it on the campaign trail. He said it in his inaugural address. He has to be seen, at least, and I do think this is his true belief as well, that he is trying to get America out of the equation, and that the only way they'd have an involvement is some sort of financial payback type of deal. There is very limited appetite in this country from, people outside of kind of the political circles in Washington for any involvement in Ukraine. They see it as somebody else's problem, not theirs. They want the focus put on the economy, put on housing, all of those kind of, punter issues here in the US. So Donald Trump and what he's doing with Zelensky and the other European leaders is trying to generate a win for himself, that he can say, hey, look what I did. I took that hardline position, and now we have these 20 countries saying we'll do what just a week or two ago we were saying only America can do. That he's spread this power through strength mode through into other countries, and they've listened to him and they've followed his action.
And Chris, let's talk about what this is doing for punter issues in the UK, because, Keir Starmer famously had 5 missions and 6 milestones and 3 priorities. None of them were really becoming a sort of wartime leader, coordinating a group of 20 countries who might be going and being in Ukraine to police a peace deal.
No. And so what we're seeing from the Prime Minister, and we saw a bit of it today, he's been in Merseyside at Camel Laird, the shipyard in Birkenhead, and we've seen him begin to just tentatively step into this kind of argument in the last few days. His attempt, as any leader in his position would be likely to do, to try and make an argument that he can stitch his domestic agenda to the international agenda. So this idea that national security is economic security, that you can provide well-paid, highly skilled jobs in the defence sector connected to this boost in defence spending that was announced a week or so ago. And I think we'll see. He's been doing that tentatively, not because he doesn't believe it, but because the fundamentals of what he's been saying out loud in the last few days have been more international and diplomatic. I think where we'll get to, I would hazard a reasonable guess relatively soon, is that argument is fleshed out. Because if there is a sense, as seems likely, that this international geopolitical picture is going to dominate politics for some time, then he's going to want to be also aware and make it obviously aware publicly that there's that so many of people's pressing day-to-day domestic concerns are obviously, clearly and obviously still there.
And in terms of the public finances, we've got a spending review happening where they decide what the budgets are going to be for each individual government department, and we'll hear about that in a couple of months' time. But there's also a defence review going on about like kind of the future of all of this stuff with security. But there's also then Rachel Reeves's spring statement coming up in a couple of weeks' time, where all the noises are that, oh, the global economic picture is even worse than people thought. Actually, there's even less money around for public spending, but yet we're now being told that we're going to have to put loads more money on defence. It's like it seems that kind of everything has gone up in the air now when it comes to money.
The one thing politically that I think gives them a bit of wriggle room now is that, to quote in terms both the Prime Minister and Kemi Badenoch, the Conservative leader, the world has changed. The things are very different, and that does allow a political leadership a bit of space to say exactly that and use that as the context, some might say the excuse for, doing things that would have seemed implausible just a matter of months ago. And what we're clearly getting, and we had this from the Prime Minister in the last 10 days with that defence announcement, is a far bigger national conversation coming in the coming years about not just, and I say just in inverted commas, you tilt from defence spending now to 2.5% of national income by 2027 with that decision, not uncontroversial. First resignation on a matter of principle of a government minister for Labour in power, with Annalise Dodds resigning. But that far bigger question about how you get to 3% or beyond, or wherever the conversation gets to in the coming years, with arguably much tougher decisions around the trade-offs on public spending.
Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because on the way into the Newscast studio, I was reading a column in the Financial Times by Robert Shrimsley, and he was saying this period now reminds him a little bit of Rishi Sunak's budget he did just when COVID was starting to bubble up. And in retrospect, that was such small potatoes compared to the crisis that actually came along. And then, James, when we arrived in the studio together, I was asking you, because you're a better historian than me, is this 1990 and the end of the Cold War, or is this 1945, the end of the Second World War? And I'm just, that's got my kind of head spinning about kind of how big a moment we're actually in. Because, I mean, there's a lot of lofty talk, and you listen to like Emmanuel Macron's address to the French people on Wednesday night, and it's like, oh, right, new chapter of history, page 1.
I think collectively a penny is dropping around Europe, in the chancellors of Europe, that life is going to be very, very different. And, this argument about, the United States urging the European nations to spend more on defence, that's a decades-long argument. I mean, I think I remember somebody quoting Eisenhower moaning about this. So this is that's not new. Where we're at now is in a completely different space. We're not just in that traditional debate now. And I think people are getting very worried. Whenever I meet diplomats, they have that sort of hangdog look of feeling the burden of what they're having to face and deal with now, because they are aware of the enormity of what is happening here. And it's been really interesting today that after Mr. Macron yesterday gave a speech in which he raised this idea of nuclear weapons and expanding the French nuclear umbrella to include other countries, which other countries have picked up. And what's interesting is that the Russians have responded. If you think about it, Putin, having been very much on a sort of submarine, not saying anything, letting his opponents divide amongst themselves, Russia came out really forcefully today.
And basically compared him to Napoleon.
Yeah. Foreign ministry, their foreign secretary, and Putin himself all coming out saying something very, very pushing back, because for them this was excellent. We'll use this to say to our own population, those Europeans, they want to nuke us effectively. But when I have conversations with diplomats in Europe now, the idea of European countries accepting not just a nuclear umbrella from another country, either the French or somebody else, but actually trying to develop their own nuclear weapon, and how that they do that and how they get around the non-proliferation treaty and things like that. Those conversations have been had. I think we're a long way off anything like that, but the world is now changing, and all the diplomats say there's Plan B and Plan A. Plan A is what Sir Keir Starmer is trying to do, which is bridge the divide, keep the Americans involved, engage them, try and influence.
Kind of classic.
Yeah, classic, but also, be aware that life's going to change, and we're going to spend more on defence, we're going to have to do more for Ukraine by ourselves, and we might end up with a mess there. But that's all Plan A. Plan B is when there is a fundamental fissure between Europe and the United States. And, the UK, in that scenario, the UK's nuclear deterrent becomes, powerless, because we rely on the Americans for our Trident nuclear weapons. That we're in a place where Europe, the Americans withdraw substantial conventional forces from Europe. In that scenario, Donald Trump goes to Moscow at the invitation of Vladimir Putin to attend the May Day parades, right? And in that context, we're in a completely different space. But that Plan B is being discussed right now, what Europe has to do. So it's not just, should we spend a bit more? Should we, tweak our debt spending rules so that we can spend a bit more than the EU rules currently allow? This is about fundamentally having to rethink the way Europe is and exists.
And Caitríona, I'm not going to get you to now write a history book on the spot. So James has just started the first draft off there. But that idea of just rethinking and rewiring the state, that makes me think of what Elon Musk is doing with his DOGE, his Department of Government Efficiency, where his dream is to slash the American federal budget by billions and billions, maybe even trillions of dollars. Do you feel like you are living through like a big revolution in just what the American state is and what it feels like to live in a country that is called America?
Absolutely. I've lived here on and off now for 11 or 12 years, and it feels very different than it ever has before. President Trump, Elon Musk and the team around him are remaking America, both domestically and, as we've been discussing, it's kind of face out to the world as well. And they've done that so rapidly in just 6 weeks. You have so many people have been laid off from their jobs or are at risk of being laid off. You have people who were working for USAID de facto stranded abroad and no idea how they're going to get back here and who's going to pay for their repatriation and that kind of thing. Here in Washington, house prices have dropped by about 10% already because lots of people have either lost their jobs and so they can't afford their homes anymore, or they don't want to live in Washington anymore and they're selling out, getting out of the city and going back to whatever states they're originally from. So it's having a dramatic impact. There's questions about the curriculum in schools. There's questions about providing school meals to the less well-off children. And, you have to remember in all of this, this is a country of tremendous inequality, extraordinarily wealthy people and extraordinarily poor people without a welfare system that we're used to on our side of the Atlantic. So the potential for change in this country that will take generations to undo is massive at this point. There's universal agreement that some change was needed. And so, you'll hear members of the Democratic Party saying, yes, some of this was needed to happen. But the pace of change just has so many people in a complete tailspin.
Wow, fascinating. And what an amazing note to end this episode on. Caitríona, thank you very much.
Thank you. Great to be here.
James, thanks for starting work on that history book live on Newscast.
Very much. Thank you very much.
And Chris, good to have you back from Washington, although I wonder if you'll be going there again quite soon. You probably don't even know yet, though.
I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised.
Okay, right. Plenty more travels on Newscast to come, and we'll give you another episode very soon. Bye-bye.
Newscast from the BBC.